Hi, everybody. Hello. My name is Alicea. I'm an evangelist at Unity Technologies. I'm based in San Francisco. It's my first time in Sydney, got here via Shanghai, so it's kind of been a blur for my team and I, but we're so excited to be here. And in particular, I'm extra excited to be here today because I get to tell you about Unity's new terrain tools for creating beautiful worlds. Now, before I begin, out of curiosity, who here has used Unity's terrain tools before 2018.3? Raise your hand. A lot of you, okay. All right, and then who is brand new to the terrain tools? Great. Most of you are gonna love this talk. What I'm gonna go over in this talk is go over what updates came in 2018.3 for the terrain tools, and what's coming up for 2019.1 support. Then, because it's better to show the tools instead of just showing you slides about them, I'm going to jump into a live demo in the editor so you can see how cool these brand new tools are. And then I'll share some upcoming features that are along the pipeline and some resources for you to reference when creating your own terrains. Sound good? Awesome. So 2018.3. So at the start of 2018, Unity actually reached out to many of our users and had a survey to see what our community thought about the different tools and features within the Unity engine. And Terrain tool got a resounding thumbs down. So if you've been working with the terrain tools before in Unity, you know that while they can be useful, there were a lot of workflow complications and things that just kind of weren't optimal for creating terrain. And so we decided that that was going to be one of our #1 priorities to update our terrain tool system to help all of you create more beautiful and more efficient terrains. And so that means that in 2018.3, we focused on two things: improving terrain performance and putting the power of terrain tool creation in the hands of our users. We built a new GPU instance renderer. So previously, the CPU was doing most of the work for the terrain tool system, but now we moved the heavy lifting over to the GPU, which dramatically improved rendering performance and had a bunch of nice side effects as well. 100 times fewer draw calls, cluster culling, twice the amount of CPU performance, and 30 times reduced GC allocations. So implementations like the new per pixel normal maps make really good use of this new renderer. In the past, terrain normals were normally calculated and stored per vertex and interpolated the values in between. And now we calculate normals per pixel as you sculpt, resulting in much higher resolution representation of surface details, as you can see here in this example. The after one looks a lot better, right? So we also added support for lightweight render pipeline and HD render pipeline shaders, and also the ability to create and connect neighboring terrains. To simplify the terrain workflow, we also added 2 new asset types to the terrain system: terrain layers and brushes. So terrain layers now easily let you define materials independent of the terrain objects that you're working with. And you can also use them across multi-terrain setups. And brushes also make it easier to create and refine custom brush shapes. Another big update that we released in 2018.3 is the ability to script your own terrain tools with our Terrain Tool API that uses an HLSL backend for brush compositing. So 2018.3 was a great incremental step towards updating the terrain system, but we wanted to keep the ball rolling. So in 2019, we are now offering a set of new terrain tools built off of that Terrain Tools API that bring a lot of quality of life and user experience improvements to the existing brushes. So of these, my favorite, hands down, and I'll show you at the end of my demo, is the TerrainToolbox, which lets you automatically generate terrain based on different settings and parameters that you input into the toolbox. We have brush user experience improvements. So we now have per brush common settings. I don't know if any of you experienced this, but when you are working with your terrain tool brushes and you change the size of your brush, let's say, it ends up changing the size of all your brushes, and so you can't just keep a certain setting per brush, and it can get kind of like aggravating as you have to keep switching around. That's all switched now. So if you change your brush size, depending on like the brush that you have, it sticks to that setting. The new UI group allows you to make these settings per the brush tool. It also includes some industry standard features that we were missing before. So spacing, to control the number of brush stamps specified per stroke. Scatter to randomly distribute splats against your brush stroke. Jitter to randomize the strength and size and rotation of your brush as you're painting, and to kind of add that more organic feel. And rotation to follow along the mouse direction as you're kind of painting out your terrain. And also the shortcut manager. The new shortcut manager in Unity is compatible with this new terrain system. So not only can you create your own shortcuts in general for the terrain tools, but you can even select shortcuts and create your own down to specific brush settings. So you can really expedite how you build out your terrains using these shortcuts. Now we have a ton of new brush types. I'm going to just demo them instead of just explaining them all to you. But some of my favorites include clone, bridge, and terrace, and really kind of giving you all a lot more options in creating different kinds of terrain. And what's also exciting are physical erosion brushes. Now, terrain in the real world, right? It's formed through natural physical processes. Things are sculpted by wind and rain and heat. And we want to put that same power in the hands of our users. So if our tools behave according to the laws of physics, the terrains that we create look a lot more natural as a result and look a lot more believable. So in 2019.1, we're including 3 advanced physical brushes which run iterative physics simulations on your terrain on the height map to erode the terrain in a natural and believable way. So each of these brushes is simulated on the GPU and using a compute shader to do the heavy physics calculations. But let's just jump into the demo and see how it all works. So here I have a kind of blank canvas HDRP scene. The only thing I have in here is my camera, some directional lights so you can see the terrain, and just volumes in the back to add some kind of sky color that's not the Unity default. So to make a terrain is really easy. You just, in your hierarchy, right-click, go to 3D Object, Create Terrain. And we have here a basic terrain tile for us to start working with. All right. So the first thing off the bat is that I don't want to start working with like a plain, boring white tile. So I want to add some materials for me to work with. So in my terrain brush settings, I'm going to go over to Paint Texture. And if I scroll down, I have a little window here that says Terrain Layers. So I can click Edit Terrain Layers and create a layer. And I can create a terrain layer out of any texture I have in my project. Now I have random sprites that I don't want to use here, but I also have some dirt and snow. I already created these layers, so I'm going to go to Edit Terrain, Add Layer to add an existing layer. And you see I have 3 here, dirt, rock, and snow. So I'm going to add those 3. All right, and so now I have a nice kind of plot of dirt to work with. Now the next thing I want to do is also set the height for my terrain. Because right now my height is set at 0. So if I want to kind of sculpt up and down, I can't actually go any further down because it's at its lowest. So if I go raise it to set the height to like 100 and select Flatten All, then it raises my terrain. You just saw it bump up a bit. So now I have some space to sculpt down as well as kind of mold some hills and mountains up as well. So the first thing I want to do when I'm creating my terrain is just create kind of the general shape of what I want, like, kind of add some bumps and ridges and everything. So I'm going to, the brush is super sensitive, which I love, but in this case, I'm going to keep my brush strength really low. I'm going to really up my brush size, and I'll leave my brush rotation as is. So I'll scroll here over my terrain, I'll left click, hold down, and I'll start adding some volume to my terrain. So you see here that I'm using those per common brush settings. So if I want to, I can up the jitter for my brush size. And you can see that as I'm painting, I'll select another brush to add some variation. You'll see that as I'm painting, my brush size is changing. And I love this because when you're making natural looking terrain, right? Not everything is the same stroke, right? Not everything is the same width or size. So having this jitter automatically take care of the variation for me makes it really easy to start sculpting up terrain. So I'll add some more here. I'll go, this brush, I'll up the strength a tiny bit. I'll delete a 0, it's that sensitive. And I can add some cool effects. I'll bring the jitter down for my brush size and add some kind of more mountainy type looks here. All right, this looks good. So now I have my, my kind of base for my terrain here. I'm also going to go ahead and like raise, whoop, that's very strong. I'm going to raise the ridge here a bit so you can see something cool that I really like, that I think is really helpful. So all right, I'll raise the edges here and raise it here a bit, bring it down slightly. Oh yeah, and if I press Control left click, I can also push the ground downwards to create dips and valleys in my terrain. All right, I like what I have here. Now, one thing in the past is that you made a terrain tile. You sculpted your terrain, you added your hills and valleys and whatnot, and you want to add other terrain. How do you get them to be next to each other? How did you get them to match seamlessly? That used to be an issue before, but now we have something called neighboring terrains. So if I go to our neighboring terrain tool, it automatically opens up a grid for me around my terrain. And all I have to do if I want more terrain tiles to work with is I just go hover over the tile I want to add, and it automatically calculates the nearest material that I'm using. It automatically matches it to the height, regardless of kind of like the edge of it. So as you see here, it kind of seamlessly goes to the tiles, which is great. And when I use my raise or lower terrain brush, I can actually sculpt over the border, no issue. So I can really quickly and easily just build up my terrain this way, add more tiles as I need to without having to worry about having to make anything match or move anything around. I can also group them all together, set them by a grouping ID, add specific settings to them and more. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and add some more kind of interest to this terrain. And one of my favorite tools to do that are the noise brushes. So I'm going to go to Utility, Noise Height. I'm going to scroll down here in the bottom. So all the brushes have the same per common brush settings that you could set per each brush. But what I like here for this noise material is that Unity generates a noise map for you. And if I hover over it and zoom in and out, I can adjust. I could click to pan. I could pretty much fine tune how exactly I want this texture to appear in my terrain. So when I hover over it, so I like zooming out a lot like this. Not as realistic, or can be, but I'm going to make it really exaggerated so you guys can see what it looks like. So, boom. So like I have like a lot of tiny little bits of noise. So when I apply that to my terrain, it kind of really amplifies those like little bits of noise that are applied as a texture on my brush. So I have that. If I zoom out, or rather if I zoom in again and have kind of a more subtle noise texture, and I start painting here, you see that's more subtle. It has less of those like kind of little like clicks and everything. So I can go ahead and start like adding some variation here. I can go adjust my brush size and add some jitter and have it kind of add more interest here to my terrain, make it look more organic, more natural, more realistic. All right, that's looking good. Now I'm going to go do the same thing with our noise material. So this is more for applying noise as texture versus height, like I've been doing, like pulling it up dramatically. So I'm going to bring my brush size down a lot here. Let's see. 002 works. And then I'll do the same thing. I can adjust my noise map, and you can even go down below in the settings and get really specific with these sliders on how you want your noise map to look like. In this case, I like the one that's auto-generated. I'll go back, whoop, zoomed in. I'll go back up here, make my brush size bigger, and just start adding. If I zoom in, it's more visible. Start adding some texture here to my terrain. But anyways, so let's say you're like me and you're using these brushes and you go a little bit too detail happy and you add too many little weird bumps and ridges. It's just too much detail, right? In the real world, things are eroded. That's how it makes them look natural. So I'm going to go use one of our new erosion brushes to help reduce this amount of detail and help make the terrain look more realistic. So I'll go to Simulation, and I'll use a thermal erosion here. I'll bring up my brush size. I'll zoom in so you can really see the effect here. If I click down and apply, you see now it's kind of reducing the kind of texture I added here. It's simulating how this terrain were to erode if like intense heat were applied. The same thing here if I go and pick, let's say, the wind erosion brush. Now I can use the Unity Shortcut Manager to do things like adjust the direction of the wind and more, adjust the size. And I'm going to, let's see, it'll be really visible here. I'm going to bring my wind over this way. And you can see, I'm going to zoom in here and actually move over. You see those little ridges that formed in the side of the mountain when I did that? So that's because it's simulating kind of like the ripple effect that wind does to kind of like ground and earth and rock. So as I do a couple more passes, you can see it really pop up in some places. This is another way to kind of help add that realism to your terrain, make it a more believable world. So I went ahead and here I got rid of a lot of that detail, but I want to bring some of it back. I didn't want to erode too much. I can use brushes like our contrast brush. Let's see, where'd you go? Contrast. And you can use any of these brush textures with any of these brushes, or you can import your own. You can make your own brushes with the API as well. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and with contrast, what it does is that basically it heightens it makes your higher parts higher and your lower parts lower, essentially, really exaggerates that difference in your terrain. So if I do that here, you kind of see it start to form in the peaks here, gets more exaggerated. There we go, adding some of that detail back in. All right, looking good. Now, the same with the Sharpen Peaks tool. So let's say I want to make my, just the tops of the mountains here look a lot more sharper. I'll go ahead and use that brush, and I'll pinch them and make them kind of like jagged cliffs, so to speak, you know? All right, so I did that, and I also want to show you the slope flatten. So this is good if you want to create like kind of like natural slopes, especially things like kind of like hills going into valleys or into rivers. So my brush is really big. I'm going to reduce the size for this one. Reduce the strength a bit. If I kind of slope it out over here, so you can kind of like gently slope the terrain out into the ground below, or I can get really exaggerated and kind of like really get in there. It looks a lot more natural than just lowering the terrain, you know? You can kind of just like smooth it out. So we also have the pinch, smudge, and twist brushes. These are a lot of fun. I like to think of the pinch one like as if you were to pinch kind of like a pile of sand, like that effect that it would make. So I'll use one of the regular brushes, and I'll go pinch this area here. So it kind of pinches it, squishes them together. There we go. And then I will use the smudge brush. And kind of as its namesake, if I go and just start smudging here, it'll smudge the terrain like almost like finger paint, like if I'm finger painting the terrain, which I love doing. It's a lot of fun. So, all right. So I love using smudge for things like sand dunes. It looks really good that way. So with smudge, we also have twist. I love twist. I haven't used it yet in one of my projects because I'm like, whoa, like it looks so cool. I'm not sure. I'm saving it for something good. But let's see, where am I going to put it here? I'll make it over here, right on top of this peak. I'll reduce my brush size. And I'll click and hold and kind of move my brush a bit. And you see it makes a cool little swirl. Zoom in there so you can see it better. So I had a kind of like a light brush strength here. This is cool for doing things like a spiral up a mountain, or you can do, sometimes I do that brush and do like kind of like a volcano effect. And I'll use like the raise or lower terrain brush and kind of push it down in the middle a little bit. Control. There's lots of different ways that you can use these brushes to create some really cool effects. So, all right, so I've kind of shaped my terrain in the forms that I wanted it to be in. I want to show you some cool other brushes that can help you kind of just add some more detail and interest, depending on especially what kind of game you're making. One of the ones I love is the bridge tool. So with the bridge brush, this lets you automatically create a bridge that can go over kind of a big dip or valley in your terrain, or maybe you want to cut a path across a mountain. I don't know about you guys, I was playing a lot of Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and going over those mountains sometimes is like, I wish there was just like a pathway like right through it. I kind of like get my fix by using this terrain tool here by doing that. So let's see, what's a good spot? Right here, between that kind of funky volcano thing I did here and this other side. I'll reduce the size of the brush strength and the size overall. I will control click to add my kind of point A destination and go to where I want my point B and just left click. And it automatically creates a pathway through my terrain. Now this, since it was over kind of like a dip, it created that kind of immediate bridge. If I go over to, let's say, a place with a ridge, this works here. I'll select the point A here, add point B over here, and it cut a path right through my terrain. And then this is when I would go ahead and start adding things in like the erosion brush to help make that kind of cut that I made look less drastic and more realistic. If you're building a game world, this is a great way to create like your pathways or maybe kind of like your pockets where you want to have your enemies. You can build a bunch of kind of bridges together, make it like a cool like pit. There's lots of cool ways I've been seeing this brush being used. It's a lot of fun. I also like the clone brush. So kind of like you would see in an image editing software, essentially I can hover over the area that I want with my brush here. I'm going to pick a unique looking texture. The volcano works. I'll control click to select my source, and you can see that now it's applied essentially as a mesh to my brush. So if I go to anywhere else in my terrain and I click, you'll see that it was duplicated over here at the other side of my mountain. Now, this is a really great way to, let's say, if there's like certain elements of your terrain that repeat often, you can go ahead and just start cloning it, adding it around your scene, building it up from there. We also have, let's see, the mesh stamp tool is cool. I really like this one. So you can use any mesh in your Unity project to add texture or whatever you want to your terrain, and it'll basically look, it'll match what the terrain that you're placing it on. So I'll go select my mesh, select this one. You can press Shift to activate controls to kind of transform your mesh, adjust the size and more to fit in your scene. So I'll bring it up like this. I can adjust how high I want it or lower. I'll go ahead and add it here. And look at that. So now you know how to bury a body in Unity. So if anyone asks you, hey, what did you do at Unity-ANZSEA? You can be like, I learned how to bury a body. So you're welcome. But you know, there's all different types of meshes that you can add here. Some people prefer to sculpt their mountain specifically or things for levels, and then you could just drop them down into your terrain. So let's see what else. The Terrace Brush. I like the Terrace Brush because I like games that are like in the jungle and have things like temples and such. So this one kind of reminds me of that. It's also a good way to add kind of more accessible areas in your game to your player characters if they need to walk somewhere, let's say. So I'm going to find a good spot for this one. Let's see. Actually, this duplicate volcano here can work fine. All right, so if I go scroll in here and use the Terrace Brush, I'm going to make the Terrace Brush really exaggerated on my first pass so you can understand how it's working. So you can adjust the terrace count, the jitter, the variation of it, and the kind of the weight of the inner corners. So I'll tweak these values a bit, but I'll leave it kind of pretty low so you can tell what I'm doing. Add some jitter, inner corner weight as well. And I'll go paint this here. And you see now I have kind of like those jagged, whoa, zoomed in too much, those jagged kind of like steps. And so this is obviously kind of a really exaggerated way to do it, although it's great for doing something, let's say, like pyramids. But if I up the terrace count, then our ridges get a lot more subtle. In fact, that's really subtle. Here we go. So there we go. So then you can add kind of your variation kind of at the specifics that you want. So yeah, so now that we've kind of gone and molded our terrain and kind of sculpted around and done these different things, I want to go ahead and go paint some texture. So I'm going to go back to my paint texture brush, and I'm going to use my per brush common settings to kind of control how I want to paint my materials onto my terrain. So brush strength in this case, when you're painting your textures, is just like your alpha. How strong do you want it to be applied as you're painting? So I like to make it really kind of really transparent so I can layer it on and it makes it look more natural as I'm adding materials to my terrain. So add some rock to kind of the more rockier areas here in kind of my weird mountain range. And I'm adding these here. All right. Do a couple passes, make it more darker, more noticeable in the middle. And then I'll go adjust my brush size, make it smaller but with some more jitter, and add some snow and kind of layer that up over kind of like the top peaks here in my mountain. All right, hide the body, so on. All right, well now it's more noticeable. See, I can't do this. I'll stick to making terrains. So that's kind of like the basics of the terrain tools. I'm short on time, so I'm gonna start wrapping up. But this is my example. So my background's more in programming, right? I'm not an artist. I don't spend my time making like these gorgeous terrains and worlds. But if this is what I was able to create in 10 minutes, I guess, with all of you, imagine if you are wonderfully, talentedly artistic, and you have half an hour, a week, or more, you can start using these tools to create some really, really gorgeous terrains. Now, there's one last thing I want to show you, and that's the Terrain Toolbox. So I'm going to group these together and hide these, or let's see, just hide them together. All right, so if I go to the Terrain Tools window in my editor, the window, and I go to Terrain Toolbox. This is a brand new wizard that was added to Terrain Tools. I actually begged the team for this to be ready for me to show you guys here today, so I'm actually really excited about this. But this is a way that you can either use this wizard to create terrains for you, or you can use it to mass edit the settings of your existing terrains in your project, or use it to do some special utilities, things like clean remove. Let's say like when you delete your terrain, the asset still stays in your project somewhere. If you use clean remove, it just completely deletes it from your project. Terrain edit, you can select multiple terrains and copy the data. You can split the terrains into tiles and more. But I can get ahead of myself. Let me make a terrain first. So here what I want to do is set my terrain width, my terrain length, and my height. So I'll put it by 1,000 units, 500 units high. I'll set the start position to just 000 transform point. And I want my terrain to be 2 tiles by 2 tiles wide. So I'll have 4 neighboring terrains to work with. I'll keep their group ID to 0, so they're all grouped together. And what I can do here is I can select a height map and actually import that directly in for my terrains. So I have a height map already here in my project that I actually generated in Photoshop using the Generate Clouds tool. I made a noise texture. I saved that as a raw file. If you're going to do it that way, if you're going to create your own raw files for your height maps, be sure to save it as a grayscale raw file in Photoshop or whatever program that you're using. Otherwise, it won't work. It has to be a grayscale raw file. And you can import that into Unity. There's also several websites out there where you can get real life, to map data as height maps that you can import into your projects as well. I think one is called OpenStreetMap. There's a couple of others out there. A lot of them are run by like universities and such. You can get that data, download it as a height map, and also import that straight into Unity. In this case, I have this height map that I generated. I have the resolution and everything set. And I'm going to just hit Create. And if I close my terrain window, you see it automatically created a terrain for me. So for those of you who already have, for example, a perfect height map to reference, this saves you all the time that I just did building a terrain. You can do it in seconds. If I go back to my Terrain Tools window and go to Terrain Settings, I can go and say, add basic settings for each of my terrains, like having the pixel error, or if I wanted to cast shadows, the mesh resolutions and more. And for the terrain utilities, like I mentioned, being able to split a terrain, so I'll select one of them here. All right, it's this one over here. All right, so I have that top corner one. If I go and say, all right, I like those settings. All right, I'll hit split. And now you see I have a bunch more terrain. So if I go click this one, 10-year section. So easier way, if you realize that your terrain tile is too big, you added too much in one, you don't have to delete it. You don't have to start over. You can just split it and just have it work that way. So you can add terrain layers to all your terrains. So if I go add materials, whoops, what have I done? All right. This is super, super preview mode. That's not out yet. So slight little bugs and stuff when I use it. I'll just reopen the window. Whatever. So all I do is just select the terrain layers assets that I made earlier. It lets me make a palette, essentially. I add each of those existing layer assets that I made, and it automatically applies them to the terrain. And what's even better is that if you have an existing splat map, you can assign your layers to that splat map data, and so it actually will just plot out all the areas that you want it to paint for you. So this is just kind of a brief sampling. I could go on, but I know my time is kind of running up. But yeah, now you've gotten kind of an overview of all the updates that are coming to the terrain tools. I'll go back to my deck to wrap up quick. So what's coming up? All these new brushes are coming out for 2019.1. So 2019.1 is out already. The new terrain tool updates are going to be released as a package to the package manager. How many people here are familiar with the package manager? Okay, some of you. All right, most of you. Okay, that's great. So for those of you who aren't, you can get Unity tools and packages and such as they're in production straight through the Unity editor. Just go to Window, Package Manager. And it's a lot better than trying to find the Unity GitHub page that you need, cloning the project, bringing it into your existing Unity project. If you use the package manager, you can get tools like the terrain tools imported directly into your project automatically. So tentative for 2019.2 are physics-based material painting. I love this one. So you know those erosion brushes that I was using? When terrain and such erodes in real life, for example, if you have like a mountain of rock covered in dirt, when that dirt erodes, you see the rock underneath it. So the physics-based material painting will allow you to kind of reveal the materials underneath as you're painting and eroding on your terrain. And the mask by slope and height functionality helps you kind of do masks for height such on your terrain. And that's an example of what the material kind of erosion looks like. And these are some resources for you. So if you want to get started tinkering with the terrain tools, check out the terrain tools on GitHub. This is where it lives right now before it gets added to the package manager. A couple of the brushes I've shown today are already available through that link. And also the terrain forum. So we have a great forum full of all our users for the terrain system where they're sharing ideas and the terrains they're working on. And it's also a great way to connect directly with Unity's terrain team. So you can find them there on that forum as well. But that's it for me. Thank you so much. Y'all have been great. If you have any questions, I'll go hang out right outside the hall here. But thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Unite Sydney. Thank you.